Welcome. I'm Inspector Purbright, and tonight I invite you into a new mystery.
Something was left behind in Flaxborough. A strange flower, a forgotten room, and a note from someone who's been dead for 6 years. The question is, what came back that night? A memory, a warning, or something worse? And you, where are you listening from tonight? Are you alone? Are the doors locked? This is Room Where Death Returned. It began, as such matters often do in Flaxborough, with a geranium, or something that very much appeared to be one. Miss Peebling, secretary of the Ladies' Ethical Gardening Society, discovered the plant midway through the annual Memorial Horticultural Exhibition, held, as ever, in the draft-prone hall behind St. Osmond's. She had been inspecting the unusual perennials category, which, she later clarified, did not include begonias despite Mrs. Digby's repeated insistence, when she noticed the pale, spindly thing tucked into a chipped Royal Worcester vase. It was set aside on its own table, labelled in a faintly trembling hand, "For Miss L.P., Return to Origin." The table, according to the exhibition map, was supposed to be empty. It was reserved, quaintly and irrevocably, for the late Mr. Throstle's ghost display, a ceremonial space left blank in his honour since the fuchsia incident of 1973. No one had moved the plant there. No one claimed to have seen it arrive. Miss Peebling, after a few pointed sniffs, summoned Councillor Mrs. Mildred Montgomery, retired corseteer and known meddler, who in turn summoned Mr. Strap the caretaker, who summoned tea. That being insufficient to dispel the creeping unease, someone, it's not clear who, suggested involving the police. The call reached Inspector Purbright at 4:47 p.m. He was in the process of replacing the inkwell lid on Sergeant Love's desk, which had a troubling tendency to jam, and accepted the interruption with his usual expression of mild patience, tinged with ironic curiosity. "Sergeant," he said, sliding the inkwell closed with finality, "would you be so kind as to retrieve your bicycle pump?" Love blinked. "Sir, I believe we're being invited to investigate a horticultural haunting." By the time Purbright and Love arrived at St. Osmond's Hall, the exhibition had descended into a sort of genteel panic, the kind that involved passive-aggressive jam tasting and ostentatiously clutched handbags. The plant, meanwhile, sat entirely unmoved. Its petals, if they were petals, had the faintest reddish tinge, like dried ink. A few of the older ladies claimed the thing gave off a smell reminiscent of the 1946 church roof fire, though this was disputed by the local baker, who insisted it reminded him of fresh putty. What stood out, however, was not the plant's appearance, but what lay beneath it. Inspector Purbright crouched slowly, shifting his weight as if studying the varnish on the table leg. His eyes lingered not on the strange flora, but on a small square of paper pinned beneath the vase. He read it twice, then removed his spectacles and gave the note a third glance through the lens of unspoken memory. Sergeant Love peered over his shoulder. "Just a name, sir." "Yes," said Purbright mildly, though not one we expected to see again. The note read, "Lucilla Pencombe, 11 Ashcroft Avenue. I'm ready to come home now." Love frowned. "Didn't she?" "She died," said Purbright softly. 6 years ago, quite publicly and in somewhat theatrical circumstances. Lucilla Pencombe, once a minor local poet and a major local scandal, had perished in what the Flaxborough citizen called the gillyflower tragedy, a domestic gas leak hastily blamed on imported candles and continental looseness of valve. Her house had stood empty ever since. A few boys swore it moaned on Thursdays, and yet here, beneath a plant of indeterminate origin, was her name. Not only that, but her handwriting, or something that passed for it. The implication, delicately left hanging in the fogged air of the hall, was that someone long dead had returned, or wished to be seen to. Purbright, as he often did when something quietly disturbed him, pressed his fingers together and looked at the far wall. "Sergeant," he said at last, "what is your opinion of ghostly gardening?" "Sir, I suspect," Purbright continued, rising, "that someone here has mistaken the dead for being harder to silence than the living." He looked around the room, not for clues, not yet, but for the shifting glances, the avoided eyes, the too casual comments about raffle tickets and bramble jelly. Because someone in this town, someone perfectly respectable, possibly even beloved, had arranged this peculiar little drama with intent. And someone else, Purbright felt certain, had something very much to hide. Inspector Purbright's return to the station was characteristically unhurried. The note had travelled in the inner pocket of his coat, folded once more the way one might carry an invitation whose RSVP date had long since expired. He said very little on the drive back, though Sergeant Love made 3 attempts at conversation, twice about the history of Lucilla Pencombe's death, and once, rather hopefully, about whether begonias could be considered perennials if one was careless with definitions. Purbright responded with a faint hum. Back in the dim light of the Flaxborough CID office, where the filing cabinet creaked in protest at being disturbed, and the kettle functioned as both an appliance and a barometer of morale, the inspector at last spoke. "Did you ever meet her, Sergeant?" "Miss Pencombe?" "Not properly, sir. I saw her once at the mayor's poetry evening. She read something about brass doorknobs and betrayal. People clapped, but mostly because the seats were hard. She had a tendency toward the theatrical," said Purbright, "but there was something clear-eyed about her underneath. She saw things as they were, which is rare in poets, and rarer still in Flaxborough." Love hesitated. "You think she's alive, sir?" Purbright didn't answer at once. He leaned forward and retrieved a manila file from the cabinet. The front was labeled in faded ink, Pencombe, L. Domestic incident, 1977. "No," he said at last, "but I think someone wants us to wish she were." The file held little the inspector didn't recall, a faint smell of paraffin noted by neighbors, the curious alignment of the gas taps, and a single poem found on the kitchen table that began, "I grow where I am not planted." "Do you recall?" Purbright said. "The final verdict?" "Accidental," replied Love promptly. "Though there was some talk in the press about, well, romantic disappointment." Purbright gave a short nod. The phrase had been, "jilted eccentric poetess dies alone," or something near enough. The mayor had insisted on a tasteful silence around the matter, which had been diligently respected until the business with the plant this morning. It was nearly 8 o'clock when the second oddity occurred. Mrs. Dorinda Sprode, long-time librarian and less long-time widow of the late doctor. Basil Sprode, known for his devotion to both Greek history and women who were not his wife, arrived at the police station with a brown envelope and an expression that suggested moral discomfort rather than fear. "I didn't wish to trouble you," she said, "but I feel it may be significant." Purbright, who had a fondness for Mrs. Sprode's determined brand of civility, invited her to sit. She declined. "I received this in the post," she said, sliding the envelope across. "No return address. Just my name in very familiar handwriting. I wouldn't have thought anything of it if it weren't for the signature." Love took the envelope and peered inside. What he removed was not a letter, but a single photocopied page of what looked like a will. Purbright adjusted his spectacles. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Lucilla Pencombe. The date beside it was only a month ago. Mrs. Sprode tapped her gloved fingers on her handbag. "She was a friend of mine, not a close one. No one was, really, but we shared a fondness for doggerel and dislike of nonsense. I helped type up her last pamphlet, and I remember that signature." The inspector looked up. "You're certain it's recent?" "I am. The paper still smells of ink, and—" She faltered, just a little. "It names me executor. Purbright gave no visible reaction, but his next words were slow and carefully chosen. "Has anyone else seen this?" "Only you." "Then if you'd allow us to keep it, temporarily." She nodded, then hesitated again. There was one other thing. Rather a small one. There was a pressed flower included, slipped between the pages. A gillyflower, I think. At that, both men turned. The gillyflower had, of course, featured prominently in Lucilla's demise. It had been the symbol she included in her suicide notes, though no note was officially found at the scene, and her most commonly published poem was titled "To the Last Gillyflower." Mrs. Sprod, now visibly pale, clutched her bag more tightly. "I do apologize, Inspector. I didn't mean to become hysterical. But something about this—" She gave a brittle smile. "It smells like the past trying to put its coat back on." After she left, Purbright stood by the window, watching her recede into the low fog curling through the high street. "Two things," he said eventually. "Sir, Lucilla Pencombe had no surviving relatives. Her will would be of little interest to anyone unless someone forged it to stir something up. Or to bury something," Purbright said quietly. Love tilted his head. Could someone be trying to discredit her memory? Or— Purbright turned from the window. "Sergeant, who owns the house on Ashcroft Avenue now?" "Still in probate, sir. It stood empty since the inquest." "Good. See that it remains undisturbed. Lock if necessary. I think we'll be visiting it tomorrow." That night, the fog thickened until the lamps outside the station glowed like faint threats. In the silence of the records room, Purbright laid the photocopied will beside the old police file and studied the signatures under a brass desk lamp. He was not an expert in handwriting, but he did notice that while both signatures slanted at the same angle, the newer one had a peculiar hesitation at the P, as though the writer had practiced. He made a small note in his ledger. "Guilt pretends with too much care. Innocence forgets to." The following morning, under a sky the color of sour milk, Purbright and Love made their way to 11 Ashcroft Avenue. The house had the slumped look of prolonged disuse. Moss gathered in the corners of the windows. No curtains remained. The door, however, was very slightly ajar. They exchanged a glance. Inside, it smelled of time. Not decay exactly, but something abandoned and watching. Dust clung to every surface, save for a faint trail of smudged prints leading toward the kitchen. It was there that they found the second message, taped to the refrigerator with yellowing Scotch tape, in the same looping hand. "Tell the truth, Flaxborough, or I shall." Love exhaled. "Sir, this isn't a prank, is it?" "No," said Purbright, looking around. "It's a performance." "And who's watching?" Purbright's gaze landed on the half-burned candle near the sink. Its scent was unmistakable. Gillyflower. He straightened slowly. "Someone wishes to make Lucilla's ghost more useful in death than she ever was in life." Love frowned. "Useful how?" "That," said Purbright, "is what we must now find out." Outside, a curtain twitched from a neighboring house, and somewhere in town, the first proper gossip of the morning was making its way across a post office queue like a particularly juicy virus. Purbright smiled slightly. It had begun. Inspector Purbright's shoes made only the faintest scuff against the parquet floor as he stepped further into the kitchen of 11 Ashcroft Avenue. Sergeant Love, a pace behind, glanced uneasily toward the back window where condensation had formed despite the lack of recent human breath. It was the sort of place that remembered too much and said too little. "What strikes you first, Sergeant?" Purbright asked quietly. Love tilted his head. No sign of forced entry. Whoever came in had a key or wasn't worried about time. Said Purbright, and yet no effort to clean up the footprints they left. Smudged through the dust like a child sneaking biscuits. He pointed to the faint trail leading out of the kitchen and into what must have once been the sitting room. They followed it. The air here was drier, and the furniture, what remained, was shrouded in loose white cloths like a rehearsal for a séance. A portrait of Lucilla Pencombe still hung above the fireplace, her hair coiled high, mouth set not in a smile but a mild challenge. "You know," Love said, "I never liked that painting." It's not meant to be liked. She had it commissioned after winning a literary prize for a poem that likened Flaxborough to a mothball drawer. Purbright paused. It was not well received. In the fireplace grate lay the stub of a burned envelope. Purbright knelt, brushing ash with the tip of his umbrella. No wax seal, a personal letter perhaps, destroyed here, intentionally, yet not entirely. Careless or hurried? Love peered at the corner. "Looks like a postmark still clinging to the back. Fetch it. We'll let Miss Teatime in Records have a go. She has an eye for stamps and scandal in equal measure." They moved through the rest of the house slowly. Upstairs, the bedrooms were as cold and empty as expected. But in the smallest room, what had once been Lucilla's writing nook, there was something unexpected. A vase, and in it a gillyflower. Fresh, vibrant, water still cool. Love made a low sound. "Someone's having us on." Purbright stared at the flower. "Or offering us breadcrumbs, in their own theatrical way. Couldn't someone just say what they mean?" Purbright gave a quiet smile. "Then we'd be dealing with burglars, not Flaxborough residents." Back at the station, Miss Teatime proved only too willing to be consulted. "Aye," she said, peering at the ash-flaked corner through a magnifying glass. "That's a North Bridgeley postmark, clear as gin on a ledger, dated 2 weeks ago, too, just about when the apparition started." Love blinked. "What's in North Bridgeley?" Purbright answered without looking up. "A care home, or more precisely, a convalescent facility for women of moderate income and declining families. It's where Lucilla's cousin, Miriam, was placed last year." "Cousin?" "Estranged. Lucilla didn't approve of Miriam's preference for romance paperbacks and men named Dennis." That afternoon, the inspector made a call. The matron at the facility was brisk, precise, and deeply unimpressed by the suggestion that any of her charges were in the habit of mailing forged documents under dead names. "Miss Miriam Pencombe," she said, "has neither the hand control nor the imagination for anything of the kind. She does, however, frequently claim to be ready for a second act, which I believe is her way of requesting more jelly. And has she had any visitors recently?" The pause was slight but telling. "Her Sunday niece," came the reply. "A Miss Edith Blethering. She brings oranges and listens to sermons on her portable radio." "Ah," said Purbright. That evening, over tepid tea in the station's break room, Purbright unfolded the day's developments in his typically quiet fashion. "We now have 3 peculiarities," he said. "A letter posted under a dead woman's name, a forged will naming a half-forgotten friend, and a flower left in a sealed house." Love shifted in his seat. "I still don't see the connection." "I don't expect you to. Not yet. But someone's staging a ghost story, and one doesn't perform for ghosts. One performs for an audience." The next day brought the second incident. Mrs. Floribel Churt, leader of the town's moral calendar committee and never knowingly ignored, arrived at the station with her usual energy and 6 cake boxes. She was, however, visibly rattled. "Inspector," she began without preamble, "I received this, and I'm not at all comfortable with it." From her handbag, she withdrew a glossy flyer. At first glance, it resembled the sort of thing one might see advertising antique fairs or amateur dramatics. But the headline caught the eye. "Lucilla Pencombe, Flaxborough's Forgotten Voice, a retrospective reading, 1 night only." Below that, "The Room Where Death Returned, entrance £5. Proceeds to the Women's Literary Fellowship Fund." Love's eyes widened. Someone's hosting a reading of her poetry? Not someone, said Mrs. Churt stiffly. According to this, it's being curated by Councillor Hubert Byng. Purbright's brows lifted. Byng, that's unexpected. Unexpected and inappropriate, she said firmly. It's one thing to honor the departed, but this feels like a publicity stunt, and using that house, Ashcroft Avenue, as the venue, why, it's ghoulish. Purbright's fingers drummed gently on the table. Did Councillor Byng know Lucilla well? Hardly, she scoffed. He once reviewed her pamphlet in The Citizen and called it lyrically confused but earnest. She wrote back and called him an arsonist of metaphor. Later that day, the inspector paid a visit to the councillor in question. Hubert Byng was found in his office, surrounded by maps of local sewer improvements and a half-eaten Battenberg. "Ah, Purbright," he said, feigning bonhomie. "Here to donate a poem." "Only my time," said the inspector pleasantly. "I hear you're reviving Lucilla Pencombe." Byng chuckled. "Well, not literally, though if she could appear and thank us, I dare say she'd be charmed. It's the literary week, after all. We're short on big names." "I see. And the venue?" "Bit of dramatic flair, you know. I pulled a few strings. Got access from the Housing Trust. Nothing untoward." Purbright gave a mild smile. "And the profits to the Women's Fellowship?" "Entirely above board. I thought it'd lend a touch of class." "Generous," said Purbright, "and unexpected. You're not known for your fondness for poets." Byng's smile grew tight. "One must adapt. These things build goodwill." And goodwill, when properly cultivated, bears fruit." The councillor tilted his head. "Meaning?" "Only that I hope it does," said Purbright, rising. "For your sake." Back at the station, he found a note waiting for him. No signature, no envelope, just 5 words, printed in neat block letters. She saw what he buried. He read it twice, then tucked it into his pocket. Lucilla Pencombe, he thought, had been many things, difficult, caustic, and inconvenient, but never vague. And whoever was using her name was neither idle nor careless. They were building something, a case, a revenge, or merely a mirror, held up to the town, with one long dead face staring back. Purbright looked out the window, where the evening fog had begun to gather again. He could feel the performance nearing its crescendo. But the players, he still hadn't met them all. The fog settled thickly over Flaxborough that Thursday morning, diffusing the light so that buildings seemed half-melted at their edges and cars became uncertain shapes, nudging forward like shy cattle. At 8:12 a.m., the postmistress discovered a basket on the step. It was a good basket, hand-woven and lined with gingham. Inside were 3 gillyflowers, a tin of barley sugar, and a note that read, "Truth sweetens the sting. Tell them I remember." By 9:17, the message had reached Mrs. Cobley at the tea-rooms, who took it upon herself to declare the whole affair the work of spiritualists, feminists, or possibly the Historical Society. She was not alone in her theory. By mid-morning, Flaxborough was abuzz with speculation, each new whisper swelling the growing fiction of Lucilla Pencombe's spectral return. Inspector Purbright was not in the mood for ghosts. He stood before a corkboard in the CID office, pins and strings quite absent. He had always considered those theatrical and prone to misrepresenting motive, and instead relied on a slow but steady stacking of paper, memory, and character. 3 flowers. 3 notes, he murmured, more to himself than to Sergeant Love. Each one bearing Lucilla's mark, each one left for someone directly involved in her final days. Love was poring over council grant ledgers. "Sir, did you know the Women's Literary Fellowship Fund hadn't received a penny of actual council funding until 2 months ago? That's when Byng started his committee, Realignments." "I suspected as much," Purbright replied. He's not a man to champion causes unless there's a garden to dig beneath them. And get this, Love continued, warming up. The fellowship's new treasurer is none other than Miss Edith Blethering, same one who visits Cousin Miriam at North Bridgeley. Purbright nodded once, then slowly turned the chair to face the window. The morning mist lent a certain grey poetry to the rooftops beyond. So, he said, let us suppose a chain of arrangement. Bing revives Lucilla's name for political visibility. Miss Blethering ensures a convenient relative is not in the way, and someone, perhaps the same someone, delivers carefully placed messages from the dead. The question is why? Love frowned. Blackmail. No demands. No threats. Revenge, then. Purbright didn't reply immediately. His gaze lingered on the roofs until a sharp knock interrupted his thinking. Miss Teatime appeared, an envelope in one hand and a particular look in her eye, the one she reserved for train schedules that proved a man was not where he said he'd been. This came in today's post, she said, placing the envelope on his desk. Addressed to you, Inspector, handwritten. Local postmark Purbright opened it carefully. Inside, a single sheet of paper, unlined, with that same now familiar loopy script. I left him because of what I knew. He buried more than feelings. He buried something real. You'll find it where the earth was turned but not planted. There was no signature. But just beneath the text was pressed a gillyflower, this one partially dried. Purbright read the message twice, then turned it toward Love. She left him. Not a lover's note, he said. This is the voice of someone observing, not grieving. He buried something real, Love echoed. A body, or something more inconvenient than a memory. At 11:02, a phone call came in from the groundskeeper at St. Asaph's churchyard. They had begun turning soil for a new rose garden when the spade struck something that wasn't stone, something square, metal, locked. Purbright and Love were on the scene by noon. The box, once unearthed, proved to be a brass strongbox with an old post office crest embossed on the side. The lock had rusted clean through. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 4 objects: a faded diary, a roll of uncashed checks, a black and white photograph of a young man and woman standing beside a familiar writing desk, and a letter. Purbright opened it with gloved hands. The handwriting was unmistakable. Lucilla, again. If you found this, it means you finally paid attention. I was never mad, only inconvenient. What he took from me wasn't just a reputation, it was a life I built without him. He said poetry was a vanity, but he stole from me just the same. These checks were meant for publication rights. He signed my name and kept them. That's his signature on the deposit slips, not mine. If he tries to make me his martyr now, let them know. I left because I had proof. I buried it. He buried me. Love let out a low whistle. So this was about theft. Purbright shook his head. This was about voice. He silenced her, then tried to revive her in a way that benefited him. Bing. Purbright closed the strongbox slowly. It would be consistent. The checks are made out by Norbridge Press. His brother ran that outfit before it folded. And that desk in the photo, it's the one we saw in her study. She knew, Love said. She knew he forged her signature, knew he stole her royalties. She buried the evidence to protect herself. And someone's unburied it, Purbright murmured, to ensure she's heard, finally on her own terms. That afternoon, Purbright made one final call. To North Bridgeley. Miss Miriam Pencombe was more alert than anticipated. Though physically frail, her eyes gleamed with something akin to pride. You've come about Lucilla, she said, before he'd introduced himself. Yes, said Purbright. You knew what she buried. I helped her wrap it, Miriam said softly. I was the one who dug the hole. She never could abide getting her nails dirty. Why bury it? Because she knew no one would believe her while she lived. But in death, In death she could be made to say whatever they liked, until now. Purbright regarded her for a long moment. "You're the one who sent the notes." "No," she said. "I can barely lift a pen, but I told her everything." "Edith." "Miss Blethering." Miriam nodded. "She types for the vicar, you know. Good fingers, better ears. I told her it was time Lucilla spoke up. And the event Bing is organizing." "Let him read her poems," Miriam said, voice suddenly brittle. "Let him stand beneath the eyes of the town and celebrate the voice he once buried. He doesn't know we've taken the shovel back." As Purbright left the care home, the fog began to lift slightly. By the time he returned to his office, the contents of the strongbox had been logged. The photo, now verified against earlier files, confirmed Bing's frequent visits to Lucilla's house in the late 1960s. The checks were real. The signature mismatch was subtle but undeniable. That evening, Councillor Bing received an anonymous note. It contained only two things: a photocopy of the letter from the strongbox and a quotation from one of Lucilla's poems. "You tried to prune the voice, but roots grow louder, underground." When Sergeant Love asked whether they should pursue charges, Purbright only said, "Let's wait until the reading." He smiled, faintly, as he added, "There's nothing more damning in Flaxborough than applause that arrives a second too late." The town would gather soon to honor the woman it once ignored, and someone, perhaps several someones, would have to listen as her voice returned, not in whispers, but in words long buried. The hall was already half full when Inspector Purbright arrived. Not in uniform, of course, but in his usual plain tweed and rain-softened hat, as though merely attending a talk on soil erosion. A great many of the attendees mistook him for a retired geography teacher, which he did little to correct. It was a curious thing, this sudden interest in poetry. Flaxborough was not known for its literary zeal. The last public reading, a verse adaptation of Lady Audley's Secret, staged by the Women's Conservative Dramatic Guild, had been so poorly attended that the cast had outnumbered the audience by 2. And yet here, now, in the disused Sunday school annex behind the Methodist chapel, the chairs were filling up fast. At the front of the room stood a lectern, polished hastily that morning, and a tall floral arrangement of crimson chrysanthemums and gillyflowers. It was the latter that drew attention. Someone had made certain the blooms were fresh and unusually fragrant. Sergeant Love, seated 2 rows behind Purbright, leaned forward and whispered, "Smells like the grave, sir." Purbright, without turning, murmured, "Or memory, Sergeant." Though in Flaxborough the two are often synonymous. At precisely 7 o'clock, Councillor Hubert Bing appeared, flanked by 2 volunteers in poorly matching blazers and the nervous air of those about to encounter irony for the first time. He approached the lectern and cleared his throat in a manner that suggested both importance and acid reflux. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we gather this evening to celebrate the work of Lucilla Pencombe, a woman who, though divisive in life, gave to this town a distinctive poetic voice." There was a pause, during which the audience puzzled over whether divisive had been meant as praise. Bing pressed on. Lucilla's final years were, as we know, marked by solitude, but her words endured. Tonight we honor that endurance with selections from her unpublished works, to be read by members of the community. He gestured vaguely toward a group of seated readers. Among them, Miss Edith Blethering, Miss Teatime, who had insisted on reading A Quiet Complaint About Corsets, and, curiously, Dorinda Sprod, who looked faintly embarrassed to be holding anything written after 1930. The first few poems passed without incident. There were murmurs, nods, the occasional cough of polite confusion. Lucilla's style, which combined Victorian formalism with sudden barbed lines about hypocrisy, was not always easy to digest. Still, the air was reverent, or at least curious. Then came the final reading. Edith Blethering rose, unfolded a neatly typed sheet, and said softly, "This was found among Lucilla's personal papers. It has never been read publicly. She titled it, 'The Room Where Death Returned.'" A hush fell. The poem was not long, 5 stanzas, but it carried weight. Purbright, watching carefully, saw the audience shift from faint interest to something more alert, more unsettled. The final verse landed like a dropped teacup. "I left because the thief stood praised, the forgery framed in glass. He sold my tongue for luncheon fees and wept when asked, alas. So let him stand and love the ghost, but never speak for me." Silence, a long, uneven silence. Then scattered applause, confused, polite, uncertain. But among the hesitant clapping, a single sound broke free, a low, half-choked cough from Bing himself. He had gone pale, very pale. He stepped forward as though to speak, but no words came. He took a single step toward the lectern and stumbled. Love was on his feet immediately. "Sir," Purbright raised one hand gently. Bing, catching himself against the edge of the floral arrangement, righted his collar and forced a thin smile. Thank you, Miss Blethering," he said. "A stirring selection. That concludes our reading." But the audience was no longer watching Edith. Their eyes were on Bing, and on the petals now scattered around his feet. One gillyflower, knocked loose in his stumble, lay crushed beneath his shoe. An hour later, the hall was empty, save for folding chairs and half a plate of shortbread. Purbright stood at the lectern now, reading the final poem again under the yellow light of the last wall sconce. Love returned from a brief trip to the car, holding a thin folder. "It's done," he said. "Statement's ready. Edith's confessed everything." Purbright nodded, not looking up. "She didn't write the poem, though." "No, sir. Miriam did, years ago. Dictated it anyway. Edith just found it and knew when to use it." Purbright folded the sheet. Remarkable timing. "She says she wanted Bing to feel what Lucilla had, to be forced to watch someone else twist your words and stand in your place." "And it worked," Purbright murmured, "but not without cost." Love shifted, uneasy. "Sir, should we really let Bing off the hook?" "He didn't commit a crime," said Purbright. "He committed a theft of meaning years ago. He stole her words, her money, her chance to speak, but the law's blind to that sort of thing. The court of public regard, however." He let the thought trail off. "He'll never hold office again." "No," said Purbright, "and he'll know why. That's the punishment Edith wanted." Love frowned. And Lucilla? She wanted the truth, even if it took longer than her breath. They left the hall quietly. Outside, the fog had returned, thicker now, as though reluctant to let the evening end. On the pavement, a child's chalk drawing remained half-washed by rain, a house, a flower, and what might have been a woman, arms outstretched. As they passed it, Love said, "You know, sir, I almost feel like she got the last word." Purbright didn't smile, but he did glance upward, toward the window above the old annex. A single light was still on. Someone forgotten to switch it off, no doubt. Or perhaps someone remembered. They walked back to the car, the echo of the final stanza lingering in the night air. Not vengeance, not justice, but voice. The following morning began, as many did in Flaxborough, with a tepid drizzle and a sense that something had been only half washed away. The Flaxborough Citizen carried a front-page article that gave the appearance of objectivity, but bore the unmistakable fingerprints of Mrs. Montgomery, who had reportedly overheard the entirety of the previous night's reading while searching for her lost purse behind the scone table. The headline read, "Dead Poet's Voice Haunts Literary Revival." The subheading, less subtle, declared, "Councillor Bing's Tribute Derailed by Damning, Poem and Local Uproar." The article was careful not to accuse but took exquisite pleasure in implication. There was mention of unpublished works, discovered under questionable circumstances, and references to funds redirected through unusual channels. Bing's photograph, taken some years prior and unkindly selected, stared out beside the column with the hollow-eyed gaze of a man whose career had tripped on its own hem. At the CID office, Sergeant Love was already at his desk, reading the article aloud in a tone of solemn glee. An audience of nearly 45 bore witness to the final verses of Lucilla Pencombe, whose last words appeared to unmask historical exploitation and alleged posthumous opportunism. He paused and grinned. That's a polite way of saying Bing's goose is cooked. Purbright, seated in his usual chair with a mug of weak tea, nodded. Not an article he'll wish to frame. There's more, Love continued, flipping the page. Miss Blethering has resigned from the fellowship, cited health concerns and moral fatigue. Miriam Pencombe's care home confirms she's received a sudden donation to fund her residency indefinitely. Conscience, when stimulated, often redistributes wealth, murmured Purbright. Love raised an eyebrow. You think Edith planned the donation? I think Miriam never cared for justice, only truth. Edith, on the other hand, cared very much that Lucilla's truth be heard and remembered. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, broken only by the sound of the kettle switching off with a click. Eventually, Love spoke again. Sir, there's something still bothering me. I'd be disappointed if there weren't. That first message, the one left with the plant, it said, I'm ready to come home now. Why that wording? It doesn't quite match the tone of the others. It's softer. Purbright sipped his tea, eyes narrowing slightly. You think it wasn't written by Edith? Possibly, or at least not entirely. Go on. Well, everything Edith did was calculated. The forged will, the staged reading, even the flower in the upstairs writing room. But that first note, it reads more like longing than accusation. Purbright placed the mug down and considered. It may be the first piece that wasn't designed, or rather, the only one not meant for us. You think it was for Lucilla? Or for the person she once was? Love frowned. But that would mean that someone else had been visiting the house before the event, perhaps more than once. Just then, a knock on the door interrupted them. It was Miss Teatime, who stepped inside with the briskness of someone bearing news and enjoying it. I've just come from the Housing Trust, she said. The file on 11 Ashcroft Avenue had a visitor log. A Mr. Sebastian Hardwick signed in 3 weeks ago, said he was preparing a historical feature on local literary figures. Purbright's eyebrows lifted. That name again? You've heard it before? Lucilla mentioned it once, years ago. He was a former student, well, more of a protégé if memory serves. A quiet young man, studied literature, then disappeared to the south somewhere, rather fond of her poetry. Too fond, some said. Love had begun scribbling notes. Shall I look into him? Please. Let's find out if Mr. Hardwick has been writing anything lately. Or digging. 2 hours later, Sergeant Love returned with a printout from the Flaxborough Library's local archive database. The librarian, ever helpful when the subject was suitably esoteric, had provided more than requested. The article in question was from a niche online journal, Voices of the Small Counties. The piece, authored by Wanse Cha, was titled Unearthed Echoes, The Reclaiming of Lucilla Pencombe. It had been scheduled for publication later that month. Purbright read it in silence. It wasn't an exposé, it was a eulogy, a soft, almost reverent piece, drawing attention to Lucilla's overlooked contributions, her poetic voice, and the shameful silence that followed her death. No names were mentioned, no accusations were made. But the tone was clear. Someone had wronged her, and someone else had finally decided to remember. What do we know about him now? Purbright asked. Love referred to his notes. Moved back to Flaxborough a month ago. teaching part-time at the community college. Lives in a converted coach house near the viaduct. No criminal record, no known family nearby. Clean as a hymn book. Purbright folded the article slowly. Let's pay him a call. The coach house was small, ivy-clad and tidy, the sort of place a quiet man might vanish into, unnoticed by all except the milkman. Hardwick answered the door himself. Tall, bookish, hair prematurely grey. He wore a jumper with a fraying collar and the expression of someone caught mid-thought. Yes, he said, polite but wary. Purbright introduced himself. We understand you've taken an interest in Miss Pencombe's work. Hardwick's eyes didn't flicker. Yes, I was close to her. Years ago, I thought it was time people remembered her for something other than gossip and gas taps. Did you place the flower in her house? A pause. Not long. Just enough. Yes, he said. I let myself in. I had a key. She gave it to me once. You also left the note. I'm ready to come home now. His voice, when he replied, was quieter. It wasn't meant for anyone but her. Purbright studied him for a moment, then asked gently, You thought she might still be there? Hardwick looked down. In a way. And the others? The will, the notes, the poem at the reading. That drew a blink. What poem? So Purbright told him. About Edith, about the staged performance, about Bing. Hardwick listened, lips pressed into a thin, pale line. When the inspector finished, he asked only one thing. Did they clap? Purbright nodded. Some did. Some couldn't, but all of them heard. Hardwick's expression changed. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something more fragile. The faint, stunned calm of a man who'd lit a candle only to find it had ignited the whole room. I never meant for that, he said. No, Purbright said, but Miss Pencombe might have. They left him at the door, staring out at the slow drizzle as though watching the past condense on the glass. Back in the office, Love asked, Will there be charges? For what? Said Purbright. He trespassed into a memory. That's not yet a crime. Love looked thoughtful. Strange, though. It started with a plant no one recognized, and ended with a man who knew exactly what it meant. Purbright said nothing. He reached for his coat, then paused, glancing once more at the folder marked Pencombe, L. Sergeant, he said, there's a quiet sort of justice in remembrance. It doesn't knock loudly, but it lingers. Then he put the file away. Somewhere outside, the rain eased, and Flaxborough returned, as it always did, to the business of forgetting what it had briefly remembered. The following week passed with little more than the steady shuffle of routines resuming. Councillor Bing had made no public appearances since the reading. It was generally assumed, with the sort of hushed civility Flaxborough reserved for mild disgrace, that he was unwell or abroad or resting somewhere with good wallpaper. Miss Teatime claimed he'd been seen entering a solicitor's office with a face like a turned blancmange, but this could not be verified. At the station, Inspector Purbright found himself once again attending to the quieter tasks of a provincial CID desk. A missing lawn gnome, a dispute over the sale of counterfeit chutney, and the matter of a vicar's bicycle being painted an unauthorized shade of mauve. It was Love who brought the next thread. Sir, he said, entering with a file in one hand and a packet of jam fingers in the other. Do you remember a Mr. Kenneth Flay? Purbright looked up. Of the insurance firm. Somewhat hawkish fellow. Ran unsuccessfully for council twice. Fond of italics in business letters. That's him, said Love, placing the file on the desk. He submitted a formal complaint, claims he was the rightful beneficiary of Lucilla Pencombe's estate. Purbright raised one eyebrow. Interesting. I wasn't aware she had anything left to be inherited. According to Mr. Flay, she promised him her manuscripts in exchange for professional loyalty and discreet accounting advice. I presume there was no formal will? None that names him. Just the forged one Edith Blethering sent to Mrs. Sprod Purbright leaned back in his chair. So Mr. Flay has waited 6 years to raise his claim, only now choosing to do so because Lucilla has been publicly remembered. Exactly, sir. He says the revival of her name has restored the commercial value of her unpublished work. He's threatening civil action against the Housing Trust, the Literary Fellowship, and Edith. Purbright gave a dry smile. The living are always quickest to pursue the dead when royalties are involved. Love nodded. Should we take it seriously? We shall take it patiently, said Purbright, and see who else is drawn from the woodwork. As it happened, someone else was. The next morning, a small envelope arrived. Hand addressed to the police station, no return address. Inside, a photograph. It showed a much younger Lucilla, seated at a desk in what appeared to be her study, flanked on either side by 2 men. One was unmistakably Hubert Byng, the other, taller, darker, wearing a pale carnation in his lapel, was not. On the back, written in blue ink, were the words, "Not every thief leaves fingerprints, some leave shadows." Love brought it to Purbright immediately. We don't know who sent it, or who the second man is. Purbright turned the photo in his hands. The image was slightly blurred at the edges, a typical late 60s print. Lucilla looked directly at the camera, composed but unsmiling. Byng appeared to be saying something. The man on the right, the stranger, had one hand on the chair back behind Lucilla's shoulder. His face was not quite turned toward the lens. This was taken in Ashcroft Avenue, Purbright said, before her final publication. Could be a publisher, possibly, or a silent partner. He studied the photograph again. It's the flower that bothers me. The carnation? Yes, too specific. Men don't wear those casually, not unless there's a reason. He pressed the call bell. Ask Miss Teatime to join us. Miss Teatime, upon seeing the photograph, inhaled sharply. Oh, him, she said. You know him? She took the picture delicately. Name was Claude Wilmerding, used to run the local theatre club. Bit of a charmer, always had a flower in his buttonhole and a hand in someone's purse. Was he ever involved with Lucilla? Briefly. It didn't end well. Something about a missing manuscript and a misdirected love poem. I think she called him a peacock in a fox's waistcoat. He left town shortly after. Do we know where he went? No idea, said Miss Teatime, tapping the photo, but if he's back, it won't be for a reunion. That afternoon, Purbright and Love visited the old theatre hall, now a community centre that smelled faintly of aging laminate and distant memories of grease paint. The current manager, a thin man with more keys than expressions, confirmed that Wilmerding had returned 2 weeks ago, looking into rights for a one-act play festival. He said he might be staging something about forgotten women poets, the manager added. Said it'd be an homage. I gave him access to the back office archives. He's been in and out. They found Wilmerding 2 streets away, exiting a cafe with a croissant in one hand and a paper folder in the other. Age had softened him, or at least blurred his edges, but the carnation in his lapel was unmistakable. When Purbright introduced himself, Wilmerding gave a smile that had once made women regret their marriages and men regret their opinions. Inspector, he said, how terribly civic of you. Can I help? We believe you've taken an interest in Miss Pencombe again. Is that so wrong? Wilmerding asked. The town seems to have rediscovered her. I thought it only fair to remind them I was part of her journey. Love's eyes narrowed. You stole her work, didn't you? Wilmerding laughed. Hardly. I borrowed. She always said her poems belonged to the world. I merely facilitated their debut. Purbright's tone did not change. We'd like to ask what you plan to do with the papers you've retrieved. Just a small retrospective, said Wilmerding. I found a few early drafts. A letter or two, nothing significant. Perhaps, said Purbright. but you might recall that the ownership of Miss Pencombe's work is now under contention. Mr. Kenneth Flay has filed a claim. Wilmerding rolled his eyes. Flay wouldn't know a poem from a profit margin. Besides, I doubt he's the only one with a secret copy or two. Purbright studied him for a long moment. Let me make this clear, Mr. Wilmerding. If you attempt to sell or stage anything using material not legally yours, we will investigate further. Including events from the 1970s, Wilmerding's smile thinned. Are you threatening me? I'm reminding you, Purbright said calmly, that shadows, however old, still cast lines on the floor, and Flaxborough is very good at noticing who's standing where. They left him standing on the pavement, croissant now forgotten in its wrapper, watching as they walked away. Back at the station, Love said, "How many people does that make now?" "Edith, Miriam, Bing, Flay, Wilmerding," Purbright replied, all circling a woman whose silence has made her more powerful than her voice ever did in life. "You think they're all guilty?" "No," said Purbright, "but none are innocent." He glanced once more at the photograph. Lucilla Pencombe didn't just write poetry. She gathered witnesses. Love looked up. To what? Purbright's eyes were steady. To herself. The wind had shifted. It carried with it the faint smell of leaf mold and old varnish, mingling with the distant warmth of roasted chestnuts from the cart outside Wenton's bakery. Flaxborough was entering that peculiar autumnal phase where everything looked golden and smelled faintly of damp tea towels. Inside the CID office, Inspector Purbright was once again seated before the corkless board that now bore not photographs or red thread, but a growing stack of file folders. Each bore a name: Pencombe, Lucilla, Blethering, Edith, Flay, Kenneth, Wilmerding, Claude, Bing, Hubert. Each of them had touched, in one way or another, the legacy of a woman who, for 6 years, had rested in public silence but private turmoil. And now her name was everywhere, on pamphlets, in online articles, in council grant proposals. "She's become a cultural commodity," Purbright said, not without a trace of dry sadness. Sergeant Love, who had been reviewing phone records, looked up. "Sir?" "Lucilla. There's been more discussion of her in 3 weeks than in the last 3 decades. Each of them is carving a piece for themselves." Love nodded. "I've got something strange here, actually." He held up a sheet of paper. Last month, just before the reading, a transfer was made from the fellowship's new account to a private publishing consultancy. "Which consultancy?" "Harrier House Press." Run by Wilmerding. Purbright's brow lifted slightly. So he wasn't merely planning a tribute, he was being paid for it. Looks that way, but get this. The money wasn't authorized by Edith, or anyone on the committee. It was approved using an old signature card, dated 2 years back. Before Edith joined the board? Exactly. Purbright leaned back, hands steepled. Someone forged the fellowship's approval to pay Wilmerding to publish Lucilla's material. Then tried to disguise it under the event, Love added. Make it look like a cultural celebration. And with the reading, Purbright mused, they could claim it had public interest, community relevance, a way of laundering legitimacy. Love frowned. Do you think it's Bing again? Possibly, but the timing doesn't fit. He was already under scrutiny after the poem was read aloud. He'd have no reason to risk further exposure. Wilmerding himself, then? More likely, but not alone. Purbright stood. We need to speak with Edith again. Edith Blethering lived in a flat above the Oxfam bookshop. Her windows always smelled faintly of paper and furniture polish, and she brewed tea as though it were a ritual of contrition. She seemed tired now, less performative. The emboldened woman who had recited Lucilla's final poem to a breathless audience was gone. In her place was someone more real, and therefore more vulnerable. Purbright accepted the tea but left it untouched. Miss Blethering, he began, We have reason to believe someone used fellowship funds to pay Mr. Wilmerding without proper authorization. We're trying to determine who forged the documents." Edith stiffened. "I never approved any such thing." "I believe you," said Purbright, "but the account was accessed using an old signature card, one predating your involvement. That would mean Mrs. Galley." "Who?" "Eugenia Galley. She was treasurer before me. She resigned after a short illness and moved to Sheffield. I found her bookkeeping appalling. Do you believe she might have left anything behind? Documents, checkbooks, signature samples?" "I kept her files in the fellowship cupboard," Edith said. "I couldn't bear to throw them out. She scribbled notes on everything, sometimes in verse." Purbright gave a faint smile. "Would you be willing to let us look?" The fellowship cupboard, located in a shared hall behind the Baptist church, smelled of mothballs and irony. Inside were boxes, labeled in faint pencil, minutes 1989 to 1991, wine receipts, fellowship trivia night, cancelled. But it was a slim blue folder at the back that held the key. On the front, in looping cursive, E. Galley, authorizations and sample signatures. "Here," said Love, flipping to the third page. "That's the one Wilmerding used. Exact formation of the G, even the same faint ink bleed." Purbright nodded. "He must have found this when planning the event. Probably saw it as harmless. She was gone, the money unclaimed. But why? What was worth the risk?" They didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, a parcel arrived at the station. Plain brown wrapping. No sender. Inside, an advance-proof copy of a slim volume titled Lucilla Pencombe, The Posthumous Poems, edited and prefaced by Claude Wilmerding. Purbright removed the wrapper slowly, reverently, like someone uncovering a body that wasn't supposed to be missing. The book was slim, well-bound, tastefully designed, and entirely fabricated. Love flipped through the pages. "These aren't hers," Purbright agreed. "Wilmerding's tried to emulate her voice. But it's strained. I can hear the pastiche. The bitterness isn't real. It's polished, curated. And he's planning to sell this as newly discovered work? Likely." At the back of the book was an appendix, a facsimile of a letter found among Lucilla's papers, supposedly giving Wilmerding editorial permission. It was dated the week of her death. Forged, obviously, but artfully. "This is the final theft," said Purbright softly. "He's not just taking her words. He's recreating her entirely, a false version, more palatable, more profitable." "Shall we arrest him?" Purbright shook his head. "Number not yet." Love frowned. "Why not?" "Because Flaxborough doesn't need a scandal," Purbright said. "It needs a memory and a warning." He turned the book in his hand. "We'll show it to Miriam." The care home was quiet when they arrived. Afternoon tea had lulled the residents into post-scone contentment. Miriam Pencombe, sharp as ever despite the floral shawl, listened to the explanation with a clenched jaw. She turned each page slowly. By the third, she was trembling. "This," she said, "is not Lucilla. This is someone puppeteering her mouth. Would you be willing to say that publicly?" Miriam looked up. "Would it stop them selling it?" "Yes." "Then I'll say it." The next morning, the local paper ran the story. Lucilla's sister denounces forged poems. This is not her voice. A photograph showed Miriam in her chair, the fake book on her lap, one finger pointing sternly toward the lens. Wilmerding, when confronted, denied all wrongdoing. But the damage was done. The publisher backed out. The fellowship filed a formal disavowal. Bing, unconsulted and now further implicated, issued a rare and pitiful apology through gritted teeth and trembling spectacles. And just like that, the myth began to fade. Lucilla Pencombe's name remained, but no longer as a polished ghost to be auctioned and recited. Now she was again what she always had been, inconvenient, real, and remembered. That evening, back at the station, Purbright opened the last folder. Inside, a copy of Lucilla's original will. Real, witnessed, forgotten. It left everything, what little she had, to a future reader who sees the quiet anger behind the soft rhyme. Love read the line and smiled. So who gets it? Purbright folded the paper and slipped it into the file marked closed. No one and everyone. He sipped his tea. It's her voice that matters, not the estate. The next morning brought a damp stillness to Flaxborough. The air was not quite rain, not quite mist, a sort of clammy indecision that seemed to hang over the cobblestones like a reluctant thought. People walked slower, umbrellas half opened, glancing skyward as if waiting for the weather to make up its mind. Inspector Purbright was not waiting for the weather. He was seated in the station's small interview room, gently placing 2 folded letters on the table between himself and Mr. Claude Wilmerding. Wilmerding had arrived in a finely checked overcoat, smelling faintly of aftershave and preemptive justification. His carnation, an orange one this time, drooped slightly from his lapel. Purbright tapped the first letter. You claimed, in your preface, that this was written by Lucilla Pencombe a week before her death. I did, Wilmerding replied, with the theatrical calm of someone anticipating applause after cross-examination. She gave it to me. Handwritten, signed. Private, of course. Purbright slid the second letter forward. This one is from her solicitor. Same week, also handwritten. Signed. Only they contradict each other rather sharply. One leaves her estate in trust to an unnamed reader. The other gives you editorial control of her unpublished poems, which, as we've confirmed, do not exist. Wilmerding smiled tightly. I suppose memory plays tricks. Yours or hers? Inspector, Wilmerding said with a pained sigh. Surely we're not going to quibble over sentiment. My intent was reverence. I revived her voice. No, said Purbright quietly. You replaced it. The silence between them grew long and angular. Wilmerding's hands twitched slightly on the table. What is it you want? An apology? No, said Purbright, still calm. Just this, a statement confirming that the poems you submitted for publication were written by you. Inspired, perhaps, by Lucilla's voice, but not hers. Wilmerding hesitated. Purbright waited. At last, Wilmerding reached for the pen. And if I don't? You'll be the first man in Flaxborough to be sued by a ghost, Purbright said, standing. And she will win. Later that morning, Sergeant Love found the inspector in his office, staring out the window with a half-finished cup of tea. It's done, Love reported. Statements signed, publishers withdrawn. They're sending out a correction in their next newsletter. No profits, no prints. Purbright nodded. Good. You don't seem pleased. I'm relieved, said Purbright slowly, but not satisfied. Love blinked. How do you mean? We've closed the door on forgery, theft, vanity masquerading as tribute. But one thing still troubles me. Love took a seat. Go on. That first note. I'm ready to come home now. It wasn't from Edith, or Wilmerding. It didn't match the later messages. The style, the motive, even the handwriting. So, someone else started the chain. Exactly, said Purbright, and that someone hasn't come forward, hasn't spoken, but they were first, the one who left the plant. The note, possibly even placed the original photograph on my desk, before any of the others began circling. Another admirer, perhaps, or a witness. Purbright stood and retrieved a sheet from the file cabinet. It was the photograph again, Lucilla at her desk, Bing and Wilmerding flanking her like bookends. But this copy had been enlarged and sharpened by Miss Teatime. Purbright pointed to the desk drawer in the image. That handle's broken. Love frowned. Right-hand side. She used to complain about it, said it stuck unless you whispered to it. Love looked puzzled. Sir? Just her way of saying it took patience, Purbright said. The drawer was jammed for years. He pulled a second photograph from the file. One of the study as they had found it during their first visit. Same desk, same handle. But here, he said, the drawer is open. Love straightened. Someone opened it after her death. Or just recently, said Purbright, when the house was still locked and before Wilmerding or Edith had reason to search it. But who? That, said Purbright. We shall find out. It was Miss Sprod, Dorinda, who gave them the final clue, though she didn't mean to. They found her at the library, alphabetizing a collection of local memoirs with the grim precision of a civil servant arranging confessions. Inspector, she said with polite surprise. I wasn't expecting you. We're following a thread, Purbright said, about the desk in Lucilla's house. Dorinda gave a short nod. Sturdy thing, too large for that room, really. She had it since school, I think. Always said the top drawer held her nastiest little truths. Purbright smiled faintly. Did she ever ask you to help clean it out? Oh, goodness, no. That was always for Sebastian. Sebastian? Dorinda blinked. Oh, I thought you knew. Sebastian Hardwick, her former pupil. He used to help with her cataloguing. Kept duplicates of things, I think. Letters, early drafts. She trusted him. Love and Purbright exchanged a glance. They found Sebastian in the college library, shelving books with the air of someone doing penance by alphabet. He didn't resist questioning. In fact, he almost seemed relieved. Yes, he said. I left the note. The flower. The photo. I'd visited the house weeks before. The key still worked. Why? Purbright asked. Hardwick folded his arms, unsure where to begin. I was angry. Not at Lucilla. At how she'd been forgotten. Turned into a cautionary tale, a village eccentric, I thought. If I reminded people gently, through symbols, they'd start to ask. And they did, said Purbright. Yes, though I didn't expect Edith to find the files, or Wilmerding to take advantage. Did you plant the forged will? Hardwick looked offended. Number I'd never fake her voice. I opened the drawer. Love asked, what was inside? Hardwick hesitated. Letters. One addressed to me. She'd written it months before her death, but never sent it. He drew a folded page from his pocket and handed it to Purbright. It read, Sebastian. If you're reading this, you're probably standing in the study, trying not to move the teacup stains. You always did tread carefully. You'll find things in here you weren't meant to. Not yet. But if the town forgets, remind them. Not loudly, not for money. Just gently, like a gardener turning soil. They buried my voice, but voices don't stay buried. Not when someone listens. Purbright read it twice, then handed it silently to Love. Hardwick said, I didn't want revenge. I wanted her to be heard, that's all. And now she has been, said Purbright softly. Truly. That night, Inspector Purbright returned home later than usual. The town had quieted. Street lamps buzzed, curtains were drawn. Life had resumed its normal pace. That careful, dignified shuffle Flaxborough performed so well. But somewhere in that shuffle, a space had opened. A name had returned. A voice had survived. He placed the letter in his personal archive alongside oddments, a pressed flower, a pamphlet of poems, a list of names scribbled on the back of an old lecture flyer. And as he turned out the light, he found himself thinking not of culprits, but of caretakers, those who preserve what others try to erase. In the quiet, he heard a voice. Not out loud, but remembered. The morning arrived grey and blunt, as if someone had sanded the edges off the sun. A fine mist drifted across Market Lane, dulling the brass of the war memorial and making the bunting outside Lottie's haberdashery droop with something like shame. It was the sort of weather that Flaxborough excelled at. Not quite miserable, but full of the promise that it soon might be. Inspector Purbright sat alone in his office, coat still on, reading a poem aloud. But only to himself. The poem was titled End Paper. It was unsigned, undated, written in Lucilla Pencombe's unmistakable hand, but never published. Purbright had found it tucked into the lining of her old writing desk, behind the drawer that stuck unless spoken to gently. They will close the book, and dust will settle. But not here, not in the hinges, where the breath lives. He folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope. She had known. Somehow she had known her voice would be intercepted, delayed, distorted, but not completely erased. The poem wasn't a farewell. It was a postscript. A note slipped under a door she suspected might be bolted. A knock rapped gently on the frame. "Come," Purbright said. Sergeant Love stepped in, holding 2 files. "One from the fellowship," he said, placing it on the desk. "They've sent over the audit trail. You were right. Wilmerding forged 3 authorization slips. He used a dry transfer stamp and handwriting copied from the galley files." "And the second public complaint," said Love, "from Mr. Flay. Claims his commercial interest in the Pencombe brand has been unlawfully undermined." Purbright did not sigh, though he looked like a man who had considered it. "We'll ignore him. No court in the country will entertain the claim of a man who couldn't produce a shred of paperwork until her name hit the papers." Love hesitated. "There's something else, sir." "Go on." "Someone's broken into Lucilla's house." Purbright sat forward. "Last night," Love continued, "caretaker found the back door ajar, mud on the floorboards. Nothing stolen, but the study. It's been ransacked." "Are you certain it wasn't just Wilmerding again?" "He's in Gloucestershire, sir. Caught the early train yesterday. Alibi confirmed." "Anyone else know about the key?" "Only Edith, Sebastian, and Miriam." Purbright stood. "Let's go." The house at 11 Ashcroft Avenue looked much as it always had. Unimpressed, slightly damp, and vaguely cross about it. The curtains remained shut. The air inside was cool, the smell of dried paper clinging to the walls like wallpaper's ghost. The study, however, was no longer serene. Papers were strewn across the floor. 2 drawers had been pulled from their sockets and left like pulled teeth. The chair had been overturned. Books lay face down, some torn. Purbright stepped carefully across the room, eyes scanning. "It's not looting," he murmured. "It's searching." Love crouched beside the desk. Looking for what? Something that didn't get published, or that someone thought still might. Purbright's eyes landed on the window ledge. A muddy boot print smeared across the sill. Male, mid-size, recently made. "I don't think they found what they were looking for." He turned to the fireplace. Above it, the portrait of Lucilla still hung, but slightly off-center. Purbright stepped up, reached behind the frame, and pulled free a folded sheet of card. No dust, recently placed. It was a library borrowing slip, stamped twice, in the same week 6 years ago. The title? "Publishing and Legal Rights, a Guide for Estates and Executors." Love whistled. "Someone was doing their research." "Yes," said Purbright, "and trying not to leave a trail." He studied the slip again. It bore a library code, LPN 72. "Miss Teatime," he said quietly, "will be very pleased to decode this." Back at the station, Miss Teatime met them with the enthusiasm of someone offered both gossip and legitimate bureaucracy. "Oh yes," she said, after 10 minutes of combing through the microfiche system. "That code is for our restricted stack. Rare books, limited borrower." "Who had access?" She slid the sheet across. Only 3 people checked that title out in the last decade. Lucilla Pencombe, Kenneth Flay, and Councillor Byng. Love stared. Byng again? Purbright's brow furrowed. Number that doesn't feel right. He's too clumsy. Miss Teatime pointed with a red-tipped fingernail. The Flay entry is more recent, only by a few months. Love blinked. Wait. But he only came forward after the poems resurfaced. Exactly, said Purbright. But he was preparing for something before that, which means he expected her name to re-emerge. Perhaps he helped it along. Love's eyes narrowed. Do you think he sent the first note? No, said Purbright. Flay doesn't do symbols. He does invoices. But he may have seen someone else doing it, Love said slowly, and followed along, tried to stake a claim before it became too valuable. Purbright nodded. He's not the playwright. Just a man trying to rewrite the final scene. Later that afternoon, they paid a visit to Mr. Flay's insurance office. The man himself received them with an oily cordiality, all smiles and spotted cravat. Gentlemen, he said, to what do I owe the pleasure? Purbright placed the library slip on the desk. Flay's expression faltered just slightly. You were planning to assert ownership of Lucilla Pencombe's literary estate long before the reading, Purbright said mildly, and you broke into her house 2 nights ago looking for supporting material. Preposterous, Flay snapped. I was in Market Harborough. Love said, doing what? Flay paused. A conference on indemnity. Can anyone confirm that? No, said Flay shortly. Purbright smiled faintly. Then you won't mind if we look at your shoes. Flay blinked. My shoes? Purbright pointed. Those. Brown Oxfords. A curious match for the print left on the windowsill at Ashcroft Avenue. Not exactly mass market. Flay swallowed. You were hoping, Purbright said, to find a lost draft. A letter. Anything that could support your claim. And when you didn't, you panicked. Flay's voice cracked. You can't prove I took anything. We don't need to, said Purbright calmly. Because you didn't. You failed. As you always have. Not through malice, but through mediocrity. Flay sagged slightly in his chair. Why did you want her work so badly? Love asked, less sharply. Flay sighed. Because I believed in it. Once. Before she became complicated. She told me I didn't understand women. She said I ensured walls, not what they protected. Purbright was silent for a moment. Then gently he said, I suggest you don't speak at the literary festival. Flay blinked. Why not? Because silence, in your case, might be the most generous contribution. That evening, as dusk drew a pale curtain over the town, Purbright stood once again at the edge of the churchyard. Lucilla Pencombe's grave was unadorned. The stone simply read, Poet, Listener, Survivor. A new flower had been placed in the holder. Not a gillyflower this time, but a small white carnation. No note, no name. Just a quiet message, clear as breath in cold air. Love joined him, hands in pockets. Will this be the end of it? He asked. Perhaps, Purbright said. But I've come to think Lucilla didn't mind being forgotten. What she couldn't bear was being misunderstood. Love glanced at the flower. And now, Purbright gave a small, tired smile. Now she's neither. The literary festival arrived with a modest flourish. It brought bunting, naturally, reused from the Jubilee and now bearing a faint smell of storage and marmalade, as well as a scattering of local poets, 2 minor columnists from the Yorkshire Evening Mercury, and a novelist from Norwich whom no one had heard of but who bore a striking resemblance to her author photo, which pleased the committee. The event's centerpiece, however, was not a living guest. It was the retrospective titled Lucilla Pencombe, Unfolding Silence. Held in the refurbished parish hall, the exhibit was carefully arranged, understated, reverent, and just vague enough to discourage close questioning. There were first editions, borrowed, handwritten drafts, copied, and a timeline of her life that included neither dates of scandal nor speculation, only modest markers. Published first pamphlet, joined women's fellowship, final poem completed. Inspector Purbright stood quietly at the back of the hall, taking it all in. A placard bore Lucilla's name in looping typeface, mounted above a black and white photograph. Her standing beside her desk, arms folded, expression unreadable. "She looks like she's judging us," said Sergeant Love, who had appeared beside him with a cup of instant coffee and a cheese scone wrapped in napkin. "She probably is," said Purbright. Love gestured toward a velvet-lined case containing the original of a gillyflower for the uninvited. "Lucilla's most contested poem. I see they've left out the line about mayors with mouths like teacup saucers." "Too local," Purbright said, and the footnote she wrote accusing the press of laundering scandal in soft language. "Too accurate." They stood a moment longer, observing as townspeople moved from one placard to the next, with a careful concentration of those unsure how long reverence is meant to last. Then Purbright said, almost idly, "Do you see him?" Love followed the inspector's gaze. At the far end of the hall, Kenneth Flay was examining a display of rejected editorial letters with the exaggerated interest of someone hoping to be seen appreciating culture. "Looks harmless enough," Love murmured. "Even the most harmless men can be dangerous," said Purbright, "so long as they feel overlooked." "Do you think he'll try again?" I think he's finished. This room has nothing left for him. No applause, no contracts, not even the illusion of ownership. That was all he ever really wanted. To belong. To something better than himself. "Didn't we all, once?" Love said. Purbright gave a small smile. "Most of us settle for smaller crimes." They turned as a soft ripple moved through the crowd. At the entrance, Miss Miriam Pencombe had arrived. Wheeled in by Edith Blethering, she was dressed in soft lavender, a silk scarf at her neck, and a brooch in the shape of an open book pinned to her lapel. The crowd parted instinctively. Respectfully. A few even clapped, not loudly, but enough to register gratitude. Miriam waved it away with a trembling hand. "Let's not make a scene," she murmured. Lucilla wouldn't approve of curtain calls. Edith guided her forward. At the center of the room, Miriam was handed a microphone. She accepted it like someone taking the last candle at a vigil. "I'm not a speaker," she said, "and I never wrote a line worth saving, but I was Lucilla's sister, and that, more than anything, taught me how to listen. She didn't write for fame, or pity, or even understanding. She wrote so someone might pause for a moment and see." She looked around. "Thank you for pausing." She handed the microphone back. No applause followed, but the silence that did was almost warm. Purbright watched her carefully. In her old age, Miriam had become sharper than she'd ever been in youth. Her memories had not softened, only deepened. He made a quiet note to call her in the coming days. Not as a witness, just as someone who might know what to do with the remainder of the estate. That evening, the inspector returned to Ashcroft Avenue one final time. The house had now passed formally into council trust, destined to become a museum or, more likely, a quietly ignored literary archive that schoolchildren visited on Wednesdays before fish fingers. Purbright had obtained the key under the pretext of checking for remaining legal documents. In truth, he wanted nothing more than to sit, and so he did. In Lucilla's chair, beside the crooked lamp with its chain pull that stuck, beside the bookcase where titles were arranged, not alphabetically, but emotionally. He opened her final notebook. The pages were largely blank, but one bore a single line. "I kept the truth beneath my name, where no one dared to scratch." There was no context, no signature, just the sense of something unfinished or perfectly done. He closed the book and sat back, eyes on the window. The light outside was soft. There would be more claims, perhaps. Years from now, someone would find a letter or forge one. There would be a reprint, or a film, or a dispute over royalties. But for now, Lucilla Pencombe had been returned to herself. Her voice was no longer useful, which, in Flaxborough, was the closest thing to justice. At the station, the final report had already been typed and filed. Case: Lucilla Pencombe, posthumous activity and fraud. Concluded primary suspect: Claude Wilmerding. Statement obtained. Secondary: Kenneth Flay, no further action pending. Third-party participants: Blethering, E. Hardwick, S. Bing, H. Outcome: literary, state protected. No further criminal charges. Inspector's note: the crime, if one must name it, was interpretation. The victim, memory. Restitution, in this case, was not conviction, only clarity. Purbright signed the last page with his usual precise flourish. He placed it gently into the file drawer, closed it with a soft click, and returned to his desk. Outside, the clouds had begun to lift. A weak sun filtered through, painting the rooftops with a sort of premature nostalgia. Love appeared in the doorway. "Tea, sir?" Purbright nodded. "Please. And one of those ginger biscuits from the constable's stash. The ones he pretends not to hoard." Love disappeared with a smile. The inspector glanced at the corner of his desk, where the gillyflower had dried, its petals crinkled but still holding form. He did not throw it away. He simply let it be. A witness. A memory. A voice. The end.